I never imagined that the sound of my own breathing could become louder than my son's voice. But that was the day I sat in the kitchen, staring at my phone, and realized he hadn't called me in months. I used to believe a good mother never keeps score, but when silence becomes routine, you start counting without meaning to. I remembered how he used to call me every morning on his way to work, just to ask if I slept well. I would pretend to be busy so he wouldn't feel obligated. Back then, I loved him without expecting anything in return, and I truly thought that was enough. It wasn't until the day he got married that I began to disappear from his world, slowly, quietly, almost politely. At first, nothing felt wrong. He still texted, still visited, still called me mom, but something in his voice changed, like someone had tuned the dial away from me. I blamed it on adjustment, on new responsibilities, on love. I kept telling myself, this is normal. This is how life changes. But weeks became months, and months became holidays without calls. I watched photos of him online, celebrations, smiles, dinners with people I didn't know. I didn't comment, I didn't like them, not because I was angry, but because I was afraid my presence would feel uninvited. I had raised him to be independent, and now he had become too good at it. The hardest part was learning how to be silent without resentment. I would start dialing his number, then stop before the first ring ended. I didn't want to become one of those women people whisper about, the ones who can't let go. So I kept busy. I volunteered, I cleaned, I worked extra shifts. Evenings were the worst. That was when memory crept in, uninvited. I remembered holding him in the hospital the first night he was born, promising I would never let him feel alone. I remembered sleeping on floors, working double jobs, skipping meals so he could have everything. I never once asked him to remember those things. I just never expected him to forget me. Then one day, I overheard a conversation that changed the way I saw myself. I was at the market, standing behind two women laughing. One of them said, "My husband's mother calls too much. It's suffocating." The other smiled and said, "Well, if your son loves you, he'll make boundaries." I stood there, motionless, realizing I had become the kind of woman people warn others about, simply for loving too long. That night, I went home and looked around my quiet apartment and understood something painful. Silence had rewritten my story without my permission. I was no longer a mother. I was a background figure, a past chapter. The truth was, he never asked me for space. I had given it too eagerly, trying not to be needy. The phone finally rang one morning, surprisingly early. It was him. His voice was formal, controlled. He said, "Mom, we're just busy right now. Please understand." I understood more than he could imagine. I understood that busy was polite. I understood that love had evolved into obligation. I answered calmly, "Of course I do." Then I hung up and sat there for a long time, holding the phone as if it might break. I cried quietly, not because he was gone, but because I had spent years disappearing myself to avoid being a burden. That silence was my choice, but the cost was heavy. That was the day I stopped waiting. That was the day I decided if I was going to be silent, it would be because I chose peace, not because I was ignored. And I didn't know it then, but that decision would lead to one calm sentence that would change everything. The phone rang late one evening, and for a moment I didn't recognize the sound because I had trained myself not to expect it. When I finally looked at the screen and saw his name, my hands didn't shake like they once did. They stayed still, calm, as if my body already knew this moment would come. I answered without rushing, without fear, and simply said, "Hello." There was silence on the other end, longer than comfort allows, and then his voice broke through, quieter than I remembered. He said, "Mom, did you send me a letter?" I said, "Yes." He didn't speak right away, and in that pause, I could hear everything he wasn't saying, the weight, the regret, the confusion. Then he asked, "Why didn't you tell me you weren't well?" I closed my eyes for a second and answered honestly, because I didn't want to be a burden. There was another silence, this one heavier, and then he said something that stayed with me forever. I thought you were strong enough to be without me. That was the moment I understood how deeply my silence had been misunderstood. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't list my sacrifices, I didn't explain my pain. I just said one calm sentence. Strength doesn't mean absence, it means loving even when it hurts. That sentence changed the rhythm of his breathing. I could hear it slow, like something inside him had finally settled. He started talking then, really talking, about how overwhelmed he felt, how marriage had pulled him in different directions, how choosing silence felt easier than choosing sides. He admitted that my quiet acceptance made him believe I didn't need him anymore. I listened without interrupting, because listening had always been my strength, and this time it was finally being heard. We spoke for hours, not fixing everything, but understanding enough to begin. When the call ended, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom," and for the first time in years, the word Mom sounded like home. Days later, he came to see me. He stood in the doorway, uncertain, like a child who didn't know if he was still welcome. I opened my arms without hesitation. He hugged me longer than he ever had before, and I felt something return that I thought I had lost forever. Not control, not closeness as it once was, but respect. We sat at the same table where he once did homework while I cooked dinner, and the memories didn't hurt this time. They softened. He asked questions he had never asked before. He listened to answers he once ignored. And I realized then that sometimes people don't leave because they don't love you. They leave because they don't know how to carry love and life at the same time. And sometimes the only way to bring them back is not anger, not guilt, not demands, but one calm, honest sentence spoken from a place of quiet strength. Time did not suddenly fix everything, but it softened the edges. He began calling more often, not out of obligation, but intention, not on a schedule, not perfectly, but honestly. And I learned something important in that quiet rebuilding process. Forgiveness is not about erasing the past, it is about choosing what deserves to move forward. We talked about ordinary things at first, weather, work, small memories, because ordinary words feel safer when wounds are still fresh. Over time, those conversations grew deeper. He admitted how ashamed he felt realizing that my silence had protected him instead of pressuring him. He said he never imagined that my calm acceptance was actually strength disguised as gentleness. I never corrected him before, but this time I did. I told him, strength is not something you display, it is something you live quietly until life asks for proof. We both laughed softly then, not because everything was healed, but because understanding had finally arrived. He visited more often, not to make up for lost time, but to create new moments without guilt, and I welcomed him without keeping count, because love that keeps score always loses. In those moments, I also learned to speak when it mattered. I no longer hid my needs behind politeness. I no longer disappeared to make others comfortable. I learned that boundaries do not push people away, they teach them how to stay. Today, my house is still quiet, but it no longer feels empty. The silence has changed. It carries peace instead of waiting. I still love my son without conditions, but I no longer confuse love with self-erasure. And if there is one truth this journey taught me, it is this: silence is powerful, but only when it is chosen, not forced. And sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is stop proving her strength and simply allow others to finally see it. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as endings, but you feel them settle quietly, like a door closing without a sound. This was one of those moments. Months had passed since my son returned to my life, not as a boy who needed saving, but as a man who finally understood where he came from. We no longer spoke every day, and that was okay. Because now our silence was not distance, it was trust. He knew I was there, and I knew I no longer had to prove it. One afternoon, we sat together on the porch, watching the sky change colors as evening approached. He looked at me and said something simple but heavy with meaning. He said, "Mom, I finally understand what you meant that night." I waited, letting him finish. He said, "I thought strength meant not needing anyone, but now I know it means loving without disappearing." I smiled, not because I felt victorious, but because peace had finally arrived. I told him I never wanted to be needed out of guilt. I only wanted to be remembered with respect. He nodded, and in that quiet agreement, I felt something release inside me. The need to explain, the need to justify, the need to hold on too tightly. Life went on, as it always does, but it felt lighter. I still woke up to quiet mornings, but they no longer scared me. I filled my days with things that nourished me: walks, books, conversations that didn't drain my spirit. I learned that motherhood